Hello and welcome to The Print. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at The Print. And today we're going to talk about something very, very interesting, something that makes the news in India each time they come out with a new survey. This, of course, is to do with the Pew Research Centre and the surveys that they come out. And today we have with us Patrick Moynihan, who's Associate Director of International Research Methods at the Pew Research Centre. And we're going to talk about how they do things, how they go about collecting data, analyzing it, and then putting it out there in a way that is understandable to lay readers as well as statisticians and all of that. So thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us all the way from DC.
It's great to be here. I wish I could have made the trip out to do this face to face.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Maybe next time.
Thank you.
So now I'll start with how has Pew Research's work in India progressed over the last few years? I mean, have you expanded operations here? Are you doing more surveys related to India?
I would say that our setup has been to focus on our one flagship annual survey. That's a cross-national one. It's the Global Attitude Survey that we, again, do annually in about 20 to 40 countries.
Right.
And India has been a staple of that project, for the last decade. So we will continue to poll in India the views of Indians, very important to us. But in terms of moving forward, we'd love to do more. If there are opportunities, let's stay on the line and keep talking about that. But for sure, India is a bedrock part of our annual project.
So now, as data gatherers, within India, there are a lot of people who comment about the economy and the society and the culture and all of that. But as primary data gatherers, you actually go out and ask people things. What key changes have you seen in India over the last few years, would you say, are the key changes?
Well, from a methods point of view, we've been using a very similar setup to get at the population so we can access them and ask our questions.
Right.
And through that approach, I think we have a very solid way, I would not say perfect, a solid way of reaching a comprehensive group of adult Indians who are representative of the larger population. So it's a national probability approach that we're using every year. We're not using quota samples. We're not selecting individuals or going to particular places. We give each area of the country a non-zero known probability of selection. So it's a fully random approach that we're using here. And we think that's an approach that yields accurate and I think somewhat refined views of the Indian population. And we've been doing this again for about the past 10 years in India. So it's an approach that gives us confidence, and it's one, at least in its core methodology, is one that we apply in other countries as well.
Right, of course. So actually, I would like to drill down into that a little more. How do you go about collecting data in a country like India, which is so diverse, not just geographically, but culturally? The thinking changes every few kilometers about any given issue. The economic strata is so diverse. The rural-urban divide it's so wide. So how do you go about collecting data in a way that is representative?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's super challenging, especially when you think about India as one country among another 20 or 30 that we're doing. If I could step back a little bit, for just a few features of the Pew Research Center, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy fact tank. So we're not taking a position on any issue and how it changes or how it should changes. We're just trying to use very sober, rigorous methodology.
And that's why there is some credibility as well with the data you provide, because it is non-partisan and you don't prescribe anything. You just say this is what it is.
That's exactly right. And we've been doing cross-national surveys here at the center for about 2 decades now. from 2001, and it's really a staple of what the center produces in any single year. And in fact, over that time, I had to go back and count. Um, we've done about 115 different countries over that time,
Okay.
across the globe. Um, and we did, as part of our annual project, 24 countries last year, but we've done a number of bigger and smaller projects over time. And across the entire project, the questionnaire is translated into 40 languages,
40
more or
languages.
less. It happens every year. And as I mentioned earlier, we're using probability-based methods, and the designs are all meant to be nationally representative. In about, well, I guess historically, if I can even kind of roll back a little bit more for you and for your audience, about 2/3 of our countries that we've polled have been via face-to-face methods.
Okay.
And the others, for the most part, have been using phone methods. And until recently, in a couple of countries, we've used online probability methods. And we're really trying to find the best way to reach people, right? To ask them
Right.
questions, record their answers.
Of
And
course.
what works well in one country doesn't necessarily work well in another country. India is not the same as, say, Hungary or Mexico.
Absolutely.
So each of these, countries has their own nuances. Um, so we work very closely with local vendors in each country. Before we
Right.
got on here, we were talking about how, like, I'm here in DC,
Yes.
you're out in India. But to really get a sense of how to do a project well and what works, we have to rely on in-country local vendors to provide us with really, a sense of the local norms, customs, laws, and to inform us as researchers what works best in that country.
So yeah, so then so about India then first, I mean, so you do have local partners over here?
Yes, absolutely. All of our polls that are done are using local vendors that work in country. So
And
unfortunately,
are those
you will
do
not
we
see me
know who they
walking
are?
around India knocking on doors.
Absolutely. And is it publicly available information who these local vendors are, or do you keep that a secret?
I would ask for permission of the local firm before sharing that more broadly.
Okay, fair
Um,
enough.
that's up to them. We try and respect all of our partners as much as we can, as we try and respect their staff and the respondents as
Right, of
well in our
course.
projects.
And
Um,
so they go door to door, the local vendors?
in India, yes. In fact, if I can say, earlier this year, the way we work these long projects, they take a long time to execute. So
Right,
any single project for us takes over a year to plan it out, contract it, field it, and analyze it.
of course.
So pardon me if I say last year when I'm referring to earlier this year. But
Right.
in our 2023 survey in India, it was conducted over 48 days in March through May. It was with over 2,600 Indians using face-to-face methods. We
Okay.
translated into 11 languages, and we went to 263 villages and towns, in urban and rural areas
Okay.
across the country. So it's a scientifically based probability sample, um, and again, using an in-country provider. And it was part of this larger 24-country survey that we executed last year.
Right.
And if I can say, I'm really proud that we were able to give voice to the Indian population. We covered nearly 97% of the country through our selection methods, meaning that
Right.
we're giving folks a non-zero known probability of selection. We didn't talk to everyone. I'm not saying that,
No, of
but
course.
there was a chance of selection, and just the few percent that were not included in the study had no chance of selection. That was due to inaccessibility or insecurity reasons, and the safety of the interviewers is of paramount importance to us. So
Of
we
course.
rely on the local vendor to tell us where we can go and where we can't go. If I can dig into a little bit further
Absolutely.
to really put your audience to sleep now. The design was based upon the 2011 census. So
Right.
we're using, in-country population figures. So we know essentially, where are the people? We want to reach them and
Yeah.
ask them questions. So how do we do that? So we stratified or, divided the country into essentially a matrix, a 15 cell matrix by 5 regions and 3 levels of urbanicity: major, metro, urban, and rural. And
Okay.
then within that matrix, within each of those like 15 cells, we kind of dug down and we selected within them either towns or villages. And then from there, within urban areas, we selected wards. And that's a multi-stage stratified cluster sample approach that we're using. So we go down from these, these strata, the urbanicity regional divides, down to villages and towns, and urban areas down to wards. And ultimately, you're wondering, when do we get to the people? Well, ultimately, we select a random starting point, say within a village, and based
Right.
upon GPS coordinates that our local vendor does, essentially like a PSU, it's a centroid of an area.
Right.
You know, and the interviewing team goes there and they do a random walk method, and they skip X number of structures, X number of homes, and then they select a home, and then they randomly select someone in that home. So at each
Wow.
stage of selection, there's a chance to be included or not included,
Right.
in the study. And it all starts with the Indian census, and that's how we
Yeah.
allocate our sample. So the sample that we have ultimately is proportionate to the population of the country.
Okay. And now using the census, you get an idea of where the population largely resides.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, there's a lot of divergence in within the country about, even things like how they perceive their own political leaders, for example. So if you ask them a question, how do you view the prime minister, whoever the prime minister is, but how do you view the prime minister? It might be that in different parts of the country, their local, the state chief minister is more important. And so their views on the prime minister might not be that important or that big in their political outlook. Whereas in other parts of the country, the prime minister might be very big in their political outlook. So how do you do the weightages in that case?
Yeah, you're pointing to like a real challenge in this type of study, and in some ways you're speaking to the potential issues of of non-attitudes, or how people how strongly people feel about a topic that you're asking them. Maybe they feel more strongly, or they know more about the local politicians and not the national ones. What
Right.
really matters to a population. And frankly, that's a really hard question when you're doing a hard question to answer in a cross-national survey, because
Right.
ultimately we like to be asking the same questions across the countries, so it can compare attitudes in India with attitudes in other parts of the world. So
Absolutely.
so that leads us to ask very broad questions. So in terms of, say, political leaders, we'll focus on, say, presidents or prime ministers within a country,
Right.
rather than digging down into local level leaders, because we're focusing on the national level.
I
and
understand.
and that's what we're trying to keep in mind in each of the countries. But it's super challenging, because oftentimes respondents can express an opinion to an interviewer, but it's weakly held. They don't have a strong sense of it. And if you ask a question to be polite, oftentimes people will give you an answer. But
Yeah.
just so you and your viewers know, all of our surveys are voluntary. This is made clear in the consent language when we open the
Hmm.
questionnaire. Folks don't have to participate at all in the entire questionnaire and can refuse. And that's unfortunate, but that's perfectly fine and acceptable. And also, if people agree to take the survey, they can express that they don't know, or they can refuse to answer any questions. So they don't have to answer every item. So if they have a weakly held opinion, they can't say, I don't know. And then the interviewer will simply move on to the next question.
Okay.
So, but I hear what you're saying, that views are held more intensely in some by some more than others. But hopefully, by having this nationally representative sample, we're getting a fair mix of people who feel strongly about issues and people who feel less strongly,
Right.
and that we can accurately represent all of their different views. Because
Sure.
for sure, India and a lot of other countries, there's a great deal of diversity.
Yeah, very much so. And so now, have you got feedback from the local partners in India? Are people increasingly willing to answer these kind of questions, or do you find that the number of people who are not willing to answer questions has increased?
You know, I think over time our response rates in India are quite good. So,
Oh, that's good.
and you know, that's in part in comparison to phone surveys where response rates can be actually much lower. With face-to-face, you tend to get higher cooperation, and we're very pleased. I think our response rates are hover around 50% in India. And when you think about the burdens that people have on their everyday lives and their time, you know, for them to, you know, take a solid half hour of their day to answer our
Right.
questions, that's asking a lot. So that we have that level of response is quite good. Now, there have been moments where, because of various political reasons, response rates may fluctuate in
Mm-hmm.
certain parts of the country versus others. But on the whole, our local vendors are quite satisfied with India, and us here, you know, looking across, you know, all countries. You know, I think the response rates in India are very satisfying. Again, given the demands that people are making. Remember, you know, the way we're approaching this, we're not contacting you in advance and
Yeah, you just
necessarily
show
setting
up.
up an appointment, just
Yeah.
randomly going, you know, knocking on the door and seeing if people are available. Now, once say I've knocked on your door and we've selected you randomly from all their household adult household members, if you're not available, then we can return, you know, a couple of more times.
Okay.
You know, so we're not just interviewing people who are, you know, available. They're at, you know, they're just at home with little to do, but it's still asking a lot.
Of course.
So we really
And
appreciate the respondents' time.
so if you say that about 50% decline to answer, then what do you do for survey purposes? Do you go and ask other people, or do you just account for that in your calculations?
What would you do when someone um, refuses to take the survey? We'll continue to interview to essentially replace that single refusal. If
Right?
someone says no, so we do have substitution methods to randomly select another person to take
Okay.
the survey. We do at the end of the survey have various calibrations and weighting to adjust for non-response. So our demographic balance reflects, you know, the larger India
Right.
population. And I think by using our in-house expertise, we have external consultants on our projects.
Mm-hmm.
We keep close tabs on other polling that's in the country. We compare our demographic sample composition to the known parameters from the census.
I
We
see.
use all of these methods to essentially triangulate, you know, whether we have confidence in our polling.
Right. And now, looking at you use the census as the population measure, we are due to have our next census should come out in a few years. They're doing the collection exercise. So I'm guessing then your collection process will also change depending on what the data shows.
Absolutely. So then when the new census figures are released, then we will go back to the drawing board with our sample design. And then we will look at that matrix, that, you know, 15 cell matrix I described earlier, and
Right.
look at the new population figure, and then allocate sample based upon how the India's population is distributed throughout the country based upon the latest parameters that are available. So we'll be back to the drawing board once we get our hands on those census figures. Can't wait for those.
Right. And now looking at countries like India, I mean, well, globally the pandemic was a blow in terms of especially data gathering, but India especially, we have already a lot of dated data, and then the pandemic made it very difficult to go and collect fresh data. So how did that impact your data collection, the pandemic?
No, it's a great question. That was, we had one large project, fielding in India at the time
Okay.
that the pandemic hit, and because of the premium we put on the safety of the interviewers and the nature of COVID transmission through face-to-face interaction, we certainly couldn't continue doing face-to-face surveys. So that project that was going on in 2020, we had to pull from the field, and then we hadn't been in India for a couple of years after because of lingering concerns about COVID transmission.
Right.
So earlier this year was in fact the first time we surveyed in India since 2019
Okay.
for our annual project.
So that project that you were doing in 2020 in India, what happened to that?
That project, fortunately, we were just about at the end of field work. So we were in actually a very good position because we had our field teams were, nationally reached, all areas that we needed to. And that, your viewers may recall, that project was released, I believe, a couple of years ago. That was our very large study in India of just
Right.
under 30,000 cases. And I'll always remember that we have 29,999 cases. Um, just couldn't get there. Up to 30,000. But that project was released. The reports are all online at www.pewresearch.org.
Oh,
So
so
that project,
which one was that?
that was the religion study on tolerance
I
and
see, religious
yeah,
tolerance, right, right.
yeah,
I remember that
yeah.
one.
Your viewers are probably familiar with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when it comes to analyzing the data,
Mhm.
countries like, I mean, as you said, that you do a cross-country survey across several countries, but there are some countries like India, say, and China, which account for the bulk of the population. And so when you're analyzing the data, not collecting it, but when you're analyzing it, are there any sort of changes that you do or any sort of methodological processes that you incorporate to account for these huge populations in a few countries?
No, it's a fair question, and it comes up when you're doing global surveys, because some countries, of course, are much larger in terms of population than others. But we like to take the geopolitical boundaries of a country seriously, and that each country is a distinct
Unit.
unit of analysis in a
Right.
sense. So India is it's one country versus Mexico versus the United States versus Australia and so on. So we're not combining all of the samples into one large world poll, because
I
that
understand.
would be a very different design,
Yeah.
and it'd be a very different approach. And you are right. If you weren't polling in China or in India, but you had this kind of world poll sample, well, that might be challenging, to make claims about the entire Earth's population. So we're doing each country separately, and
Right.
that's why we work in the country. We have our 15 cell matrix in India, working with the local company there, and we're doing some version of that in all of these other countries.
Right. And now in countries like China and some of the countries in the Middle East, do you have as much freedom to actually go and ask the questions that you would like to ask? I know this might be a little politically sensitive, but it also affects the data collection. And so I think it's important to ask.
No, it's something that comes up here, and every year, we have to think about the countries where we will survey,
Right.
and we have to reflect upon our our core values as an organization, rigor, accuracy, transparency, independence. And independence is important to think about here, because we're, us at Pew Research Center, we're designing the surveys, we're designing the questionnaire content.
Right.
So we shy away from working in any country where we need government approvals on the questionnaire,
Mhm.
where we are told what we can ask, what we can ask, when we are told which parts of the countries we can go and which parts we can't go to.
Right.
Those are all problematic issues for us in terms of being an independent survey research organization.
And just to be clear, India gives you that kind of independence?
What gives us our independence, it kind of goes back to, our organizational mission and our values. Our funding comes primarily from the Pew Charitable Trust.
Right.
We've received some other support from some other foundations, but we are entirely independent in what we do. And we want that independence to be reflected in the types of surveys that we conduct. So if we have, if a researcher has interest in a particular country, and you've named a number of countries that would be really interesting to get, accurate, rigorous polling from, but if we cannot conduct the survey how we see fit and up to our standards, we don't think we'd be doing justice to all the other countries where we do have access and where we can, give these publics, kind of a seat at the table when we're writing our reports.
Right.
And that would be really unfair to respondents, say, in India and other countries we cover.
Right. So then the backwards analysis is that if you are polling in India, that means you are getting the freedom and the independence that you do require.
That's right. That's right. I think, we've had very good success in India, which is fantastic given its importance on the world stage. And we hope that that continues, in the future. Face-to-face polling is really challenging. And I'm referring to India as a single country, but given the size and diversity of India, when I kind of look at my workflow and like India has one line on a chart, it's like India's actually quite a bit more than one line.
Yes.
But we continue to poll there and survey there because we have the access, because the country allows us to, because we get positive feedback from the local vendors, and I think a fairly high response rate, from participants. So we're encouraged by that, and we wouldn't want to work in places where none of that was possible.
Right. And now just a final question. The future of Pew Research in India, are there any upcoming projects that you are working on that you can share some information about? Are you looking to expand operations here? Are there more intra-country surveys that you want to do here?
Yeah, no, it's good. I'm glad you're circling back to this one, as I didn't get to it earlier. Right. India will be is a core part of our annual survey, so we're definitely focusing on that. We're considering. I don't want to say too much about projects that haven't fielded or anything, but we would like to increase the diversity of our sample, given the religious diversity in country. So that may be expanding the sample, doing some disproportionate sampling, which means maybe going into areas defined by the census where there are high density areas of certain populations, say Muslims or other groups that would be of interest to study. So I think it's expanding the sample, but also thinking about what's important to say about the entire population and about the mix in country. So I would be very optimistic that we're going to do a little bit more in India, with our next survey. I don't want to leave any spoilers or teasers out there, but we will look to do more and also look to innovate. I've been talking about some face-to-face methods because that's what we do in India, but we do a lot of countries during the entire COVID moment. We were just surveying by phone, and we would like to explore other modes of surveying in country. It would be interesting to experiment with phone surveys in India, because how we connect with people, how we can reach them, that changes over time. And the Indian population is also evolving, and we too have to evolve with them and do a fair job of representing their views. So I look for, in the coming years, more experimentation from us on different modes of data collection as well.
Fantastic. And we're looking forward to whatever surveys you come out with. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.